All right, I think we're going to get started, but if you're trickling in, please don't hesitate to find a spot. There are some up in the front and also over here. This is an awesome audience. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Okay, I'm going to do a quick introduction, and then we will move on to our main event today. So I just want to say good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I'm Jennifer Borland, and I'm the director of OSU's Center for the Humanities. The Center for the Humanities is a relatively new center at OSU dedicated to increasing the visibility of the humanities, fostering new research, and demonstrating the important contributions that the humanities make to culture and society. Our work often involves events like today's lecture, and we also have a wonderful humanities research group fellowship program, now in its second year, which fosters the development of new transdisciplinary research projects grounded in the humanities. In fact, I want to mention that we have an event coming up later this week on the left here. Some of our fellows from last year's group will be sharing their research on Friday at a virtual event sponsored by Africana Studies. And in another event coming up this week, the Flourishing Collective's reading group will have its last meeting this Thursday to discuss the book Reimagining the Academy. And all are welcome regardless of how much of that book that you've read. So that's okay. But I wanted to let you know about a couple of things that were coming up later this week. I also want to mention that we have a new office in Life Sciences East, room 114, and we encourage you to stop by, and we look forward to hosting an open house next semester. You can always find information about us on our website and on social media, and if you aren't already on our email list and would like to be, you can email us at humanities@okstate.edu and be added to that. And there's also some swag, pens and stickers and things over on the table, so when you come or go, please do take something from there. I also want to remind everyone that we have a reception following from 5 to 6, so we will have some catering in here by the time 5 o'clock rolls around, and we welcome you to hang around and talk to Dr. Crowther a bit more, ask her questions that you didn't want to ask in the larger forum, or just have a refreshment. So thanks again for being here. And now it's time for me to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kathleen Crowther. She is an associate professor in the Department of the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine at the University of Oklahoma, and received her PhD from the Department of the History of Science, Medicine, and Technology at Johns Hopkins University. She has published articles in ISIS, Renaissance Quarterly, and the Journal for the History of Astronomy, as well as The Atlantic, Washington Post, and Nursing Clio. She is also the author of the new and very, very excellent book, Policing Pregnant Bodies from Ancient Greece to Post-Roe America, which was just published last month by Johns Hopkins University Press. This timely book discusses the ancient, medieval, and early modern philosophies and medical ideas that form the historical foundation for today's controversies around women's health, reproduction, and fetal life. As a new review of the book in Science points out, she, quote, combines 3 decades of experience as a medical historian with a rare ability to communicate clearly and engagingly with the general audience. And this is really true. So if you're interested in this topic and you are looking into getting the book, I would say that it is in a very accessible scholarly endeavor. Dr. Crowther's talk today, which comes from one of the chapters in her new book, is titled The Dangerous Womb. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm going to double check that. Am I mic'd and?
You should move your mic a little closer to you.
Okay. Is that better? Better? Okay.
Yeah, it's not on. Hold on.
Yeah.
Can you try that now?
Okay, how about now? Okay, that's it. All right. Thank you so much for the introduction, Jennifer. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here, and thank you all for being here. Okay. we'll get started with that. In January of 2020, Brittany Pula, a 20-year-old Oklahoma woman, miscarried. She was between 15 and 17 weeks pregnant. Paramedics took her to Comanche County Memorial Hospital in Lawton. She was asked about drug use, and she admitted to using marijuana and methamphetamine. Hospital personnel contacted the police, and Pula was arrested and charged with manslaughter. The medical examiner testified that while Pula's fetus had tested positive for methamphetamine, there was no conclusive evidence that Pula's drug use had been a factor in her miscarriage. The autopsy of Pula's fetus also, quote, detected a congenital abnormality, placental abruption, and chorioamnionitis, unquote, all of which were more likely causes of miscarriage than methamphetamine use. Despite this testimony, a jury found Pula guilty. Now, I recognize that putting a picture of the hospital is a pretty boring slide, but for, I think, obvious reasons, I did not want to put Pula's mugshot, which is all over the internet, on this slide. This case attracted national attention, and it was reported in a variety of national media, all of whom told the story, much as I have, that Pula miscarried at between 15 and 17 weeks of pregnancy, and then was charged with manslaughter in the death of her fetus. But I actually wanted to put up the way that this was reported in Lawton at the time. This is the kind of local news report, and I highlighted in red every time the word infant or child was used in this report. You will notice that nowhere is the term fetus used, nowhere is the term miscarriage used. So this is described as an infant death, and she is described as being charged with first-degree manslaughter in the death of her, quote, infant child, unquote. The child tested positive for methamphetamine. Only in this last paragraph does it say that the report determined that the, quote, infant was between 15 to 70 weeks gestation. And I think if you read this quickly, or if you didn't make it to the last paragraph, or even if you did, you might be confused about whether we were talking about a 17-week-old infant, a newborn, or a 17-week-old fetus. I think given that, it's not hard to imagine how this jury found her guilty. In recent years, there's been a marked increase in prosecutions of women who miscarry. These cases illuminate a deep continuity in the history of medicine, namely the idea that wombs and women's bodies generally are dangerous places. From the earliest medical writings in ancient Greece, doctors did not imagine the womb as a warm, safe, and comfortable home. Rather, they believed the fetus was, from the moment of conception, imprisoned in a hostile environment. To understand our current tendency to control and punish pregnant women and to blame them for poor birth outcomes, we need to understand this tradition because it continues to underlie a great deal of medical understanding of pregnancy and fetal development. Now, the notion that the womb is a dangerous place for a fetus will seem profoundly counterintuitive. Until extremely recently, the only place conception could occur was in a woman's uterus, or fallopian tubes. And although neonatal care for premature infants has improved dramatically, standard medical procedure in cases where premature birth is feared is to attempt to delay labor. Even in our high-tech world, women's bodies are essential to the production of babies. So why then is there such concern about the safety and security of the fetus in the womb? Fears about the dangers of the womb are expressed in some of the earliest medical and philosophical texts. From the time of Aristotle and Hippocrates in ancient Greece, medical and philosophical writers accepted that fetuses were nourished in the womb by their mother's blood. However, this blood was frequently equated with menstrual blood, which many Greeks believed was toxic. And this lent a peculiar ambivalence to the pregnant body because it both nourished and poisoned. And I chose these pictures of Aristotle and Hippocrates. They're actually from the Oxford Museum of the History of Science. And they're from the 19th century, but I like that because it sort of demonstrates the ongoing kind of influence and importance of these figures. Also because, you know, there's so much kind of like looking down on you, which I thought was kind of appropriate for this, this particular talk. So this requires some explanation of Greek views of menstruation and menstrual blood. Menstruation was not connected to the female reproductive cycle of periodic ovulation until the 19th century. Until that time, menstrual blood was understood as a waste product analogous to urine or feces. Just as these latter substances were the residual products of digestion, so too was menstrual blood. Menstrual blood accumulated in the uterus in the same way that urine accumulated in the bladder and feces accumulated in the large intestine. And just as the bladder and colon required regular evacuation to remove accumulated wastes, so too did the uterus. The fact that women menstruate and men do not was, for the Greeks, a mark of the superiority of the male body. The male body was hot and dry, where the female body was cold and wet. And this is an illustration of that from the 16th century, using the concept of the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And you see the figure is sort of divided between kind of the male and the female, with the female side associated with phlegm and melancholy or black bile, and the male side associated with blood, the sanguine humor, or choler, yellow bile. Blood and yellow bile were hot humors, and phlegm and water, or phlegm and melancholy, or black bile, were cold humors. So the male body was harder, with more sinew and muscle, corresponding to the more active, aggressive, and rational quality of the male psyche. Women's bodies, by contrast, were softer and weaker, corresponding to the passive, submissive, and irrational female character. The hotter, drier male body consumed food more thoroughly and efficiently than the colder, wetter female body, which meant that women's bodies produced more waste residue and needed an extra mode of evacuation. And that's why women menstruate and men do not. During pregnancy and lactation, the excess food that would have been excreted as menstrual blood was used to feed the baby, first as blood in the womb and then as milk in the breasts. So for over 2,000 years, the uterus was an organ with a dual function. It was both a repository for waste products and the place where new life was generated. Menstrual blood, too, had a dual character. It was a waste product, and as such toxic and dangerous, but it was also food for the growing fetus. In the Middle Ages, the dangers of menstrual blood to the developing fetus were most extensively elaborated in an unexpected place, medical writing on smallpox. Smallpox was first identified as a distinct disease, separate from the more generic category of fevers and distinguished from measles, by the 9th century Persian physician known in Europe as Rhazes. By this time, smallpox was an endemic disease throughout the Middle East, Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa. It was widely recognized that once a person had smallpox, they did not get it again. It was also widely recognized that a very high percentage of young children suffered from the disease. The majority of them survived and never had smallpox again, but a minority succumbed to the disease. In the 10th century, another Persian physician, known in Europe as Haile Abbas, came up with what would become the dominant explanation for this. Haile Abbas accounted for the high prevalence of smallpox in children and the rarity of the disease in adults by asserting that smallpox was caused by menstrual blood. All children, he noted, were nourished in their mother's wombs with menstrual blood. Some of this blood was left in the child's body after it was born. Menstrual blood was a toxic substance, so this was an unstable situation. Sometime in the first few years of life, the child's body would attempt to purge itself of the remnants of menstrual blood. Haile Abbas interpreted the symptoms of smallpox, which included fevers, pain, rash, and pustules, as the body's efforts to purge residual menstrual toxins from the body. Most children survived this purging and emerged healthier with purified blood, but some were overcome by the poison. The very rare cases of adults with smallpox were explained by the failure of their bodies to expel the menstrual blood when they were children, forcing this process to occur later in life than it should. This was a perfectly logical explanation of the observed clinical picture of smallpox, but it was a logic that reflected highly misogynistic assumptions inherited from ancient Greek physicians about the impurity of the female body. In the Middle Ages, the European understanding of smallpox was basically taken over wholesale from Haile Abbas. Europeans saw it as a disease of children and as an almost inevitable part of growing up. So for at least 500 years, medical opinion in the Middle East and Europe held that all mothers poisoned the fetuses they carried. Part of growing up was overcoming this maternal taint. Another medical doctrine that was virtually unquestioned until the 19th century was maternal imagination. The notion that mothers' minds had the power to shape their fetuses in utero is ancient. One of the oldest descriptions is in the Bible, and it's depicted in this painting here. Jacob convinces his father-in-law Laban to give him all the striped, speckled, and spotted cows, sheep, and goats of his flock. And then he cleverly arranges to increase their number. He takes tree branches and peels off strips and flecks of the bark so the branches have white stripes and spots. He then places the striped and spotted branches in front of the watering troughs where the animals will see them when they come to drink and mate. The animals that conceived while looking at the striped and spotted branches bore young that had stripes and spots, thus increasing Jacob's flock at the expense of Laban's. By the 16th century, it was widely accepted that anything that made a strong impression on a pregnant woman, especially if it was frightening or repulsive, might leave an imprint on the fetus. So all kinds of birthmarks and abnormalities were blamed on maternal imagination. Babies born with hair lips, for example, because the explanation was that their mothers had been startled by rabbits when they were pregnant. This belief was taken so seriously and was so widespread that in many towns and cities, butchers were forbidden to hang rabbits in their windows for fear of the effect on pregnant women. Both popular and medical literature abounded with stories of babies born deformed in various ways because of maternal imagination. These cases included a girl born with hair all over her body because while having sex, her mother had looked at a picture of John the Baptist dressed in animal pelts, and that's the woman there. A baby that looked like a frog because his mother had been holding a frog in her hand, which was a cure for fever, while having sex. Or the white princess who gave birth to a black baby because she looked at a picture of a quote-unquote Moor when the baby was conceived. And so you have this pairing of the hairy woman and the black baby appears. This is a text called Aristotle's Masterpiece from 1704, but I think the original versions of this, or some of those pictures, are in a 16th century text, but the stories are actually kind of even more ancient, but they continue to circulate widely even into the 18th century. Congenital anomalies and disabilities were blamed on maternal imagination until the end of the 19th century. Now, sometimes the power of maternal imagination could be harnessed for the benefit of the developing fetus. In Renaissance Italy, well-to-do brides were given domestic objects like trays and dishes painted with images of the Madonna and Child or the Holy Family. Michelangelo himself painted one of these. And the idea here is that contemplation of the fat, healthy baby Jesus would encourage the production of fat, healthy male heirs. Doctors advised husbands to treat pregnant wives gently to avoid upsetting them and to indulge their cravings for strange foods. But even these positive practices suggest a lurking fear of the harm that the mother's imagination could do without proper disciplining. Women, naturally irrational, unstable, and emotional, made poor caretakers of fetuses. In describing these long discredited theories of maternal influence on fetal development, my point is not to set up a comforting opposition between then and now, between the superstitions and errors of the past and the science and rationality of the present. Of course, we know that menstrual blood does not cause smallpox. We know that women cannot make their babies more beautiful by staring at images of beautiful people, and that being startled by a rabbit while pregnant will have no effect on the baby. But we, and here I mean both the medical establishment and the general public, still believe that the major threats to the health and well-being of fetuses come from their own mothers. We've taken old anxieties and clothed them in new scientific garb. The deep-seated fear of the harm the maternal body can do to the fetus has shaped medical understandings of pregnancy and development for centuries. Indeed, this belief continues to inform attitudes toward pregnant women in the present. It would be very hard to find a pregnant woman in America today who has not received unsolicited advice from total strangers about what she should or should not eat, drink, or do because it could hurt her baby. A great deal of the medical and popular advice given to pregnant women over the past 2 millennia reflects a concern to protect the fetus from its mother. Some of this advice is couched as actions that a pregnant woman can take to create optimal conditions for fetal growth and development, but a great deal of it is warnings about things women should not do because they will damage or kill the fetus. Attempts to protect fetuses by controlling the diet and behavior of pregnant women have an ancient pedigree. In the 2nd century of the Common Era, the Roman physician Soranus gave advice on what a woman should eat and drink during pregnancy, what kind of exercise she should take, and what activities she should avoid. He warned that women who failed to follow his directions would miscarry their fetuses, or they would have babies that were, quote, misshapen and of an ignoble soul, unquote. Over the centuries, the advice to pregnant women on what they should and should not eat and the activities they should and should not engage in have changed with changing medical fashions. But the dire warnings of what can happen if a woman disobeys the rules laid out by medical authorities have not. In 1915, Mary West wrote a booklet titled Prenatal Care for the Children's Bureau of the U.S. Department of Labor. She declared that for a pregnant woman, quote, an ideal diet includes a relatively large proportion of liquids, a small proportion of meats, and a correspondingly generous proportion of fresh fruits and vegetables, unquote. A pregnant woman, she said, should consume 4 to 8 glasses of water every day and eat a wide variety of raw or lightly cooked fruits and vegetables. Pregnant women should also drink milk, cultivating a taste for it if they had not been in the habit of drinking it. Pregnant women should bathe daily, but avoid both hot and cold baths. West advised light exercise like leisurely walking and gardening. She was particularly adamant that pregnant women get fresh air. They should sleep with the windows open in all seasons, even sleep outside if possible. In addition, they should spend, quote, at least 2 hours of each day in the open air and as much more as possible, unquote. A recurrent theme in pregnancy advice through the centuries is that it is essential for pregnant women to sacrifice their own personal comfort and subordinate their own desires for the good of the fetus. Don't eat the wrong food, says Soranus, or you will miscarry. Don't like milk? Develop a taste for it, says West. When I was pregnant in 2002 with my oldest son, I dutifully bought a copy of the best-selling What to Expect When You're Expecting. This is the edition, I think about 1996, that was available when I was first pregnant. And I attempted to follow a diet high in calcium, lean protein, leafy green vegetables, whole grains, and vitamin C, low in salt, sugar, caffeine, and alcohol. The authors, Arlene Eisenberg, Heidi Murkoff, and Sandy Hathaway, called their dietary rules the best odds diet. That has changed in subsequent editions. But if I followed it, they claimed, I would, quote, come as close as possible to guaranteeing my baby not just good health, but excellent health, unquote. Like authors before them, Eisenberg, Murkoff, and Hathaway advocated sacrifice and self-discipline. You've only got 9 months of meals and snacks with which to give your baby the best possible start in life. Make every one of them count. Before you close your mouth on a forkful of food, consider, is this the best bite I can give my baby? If it will benefit your baby, chew away. If it'll only benefit your sweet tooth and appease your appetite, put your fork down. 2 things have remained constant through changing medical fashions and cultural iterations. The first is the premise that pregnant women need to follow a diet and exercise regimen prescribed by mostly male medical authorities. And a corollary of this premise is that failure to follow this advice can have devastating and lifelong consequences for the fetus. The message is clear that bad decisions during pregnancy can cause irreversible harm to the fetus. The second constant in pregnancy advice since antiquity is that most of the recommendations for diet and exercise can be followed only by women with significant resources of time, money, and social status. So Soranis suggested that pregnant women have their slaves carry them around in sedan chairs, get regular massages, and eat expensive delicacies. Clearly, he had a specific class of pregnant women in mind. West wanted pregnant women to get fresh air and exercise by working in their garden, something poor and immigrant women living in the crowded tenements of industrial cities and working long hours in factories could only dream about. West's recommendation to drink lots of milk would have been challenging for all but the comfortably well-off. Refrigerators were not available for household use until the 1920s, and for many years they were too expensive for most families. Milk was rarely pasteurized, poorly regulated, and frequently contaminated with disease-causing bacteria. Access to clean, safe milk was a privilege largely reserved for middle and upper-class Americans. When I was pregnant, I tried to follow the advice in What to Expect to get multiple servings of fresh fruits and vegetables every day. The authors of What to Expect asserted that healthy food is accessible to all, claiming that, quote, a glass of orange juice or milk is cheaper than a can of Coke. A homemade broiled chicken breast and baked potato cost a lot less than a Big Mac and fries, unquote. Neither of those statements is true. A Big Mac and fries, along with other fast food and junk food, are high energy density foods. These foods provide a great deal of energy, that is calories per unit weight. They tend to be high in sugar and fat and low in nutrients. By contrast, low energy density foods like whole grains, lean meats, low fat dairy products, vegetables, fruit have fewer calories but more nutritional value per unit weight. High energy density foods are considerably cheaper than low energy density foods. And this is a graph from a study that looked at kind of the cost, the energy density versus the cost of food. So you can see in the kind of, you can see the kind of lard and olive oil are up here. They're low in cost but high in calories, whereas, you know, blueberries, fruit, fish are high in cost but low in calories. So high energy density foods are considerably cheaper than low energy density foods. Further, the price of healthier foods has been rising at a much faster rate than the price of junk food. So this study was done, I think, in around 2006, but the distinctions have the price difference between low energy and high energy density foods has grown. The high cost of healthy food is one of the major reasons that obesity and poverty are so strongly correlated. I spent both of my pregnancies in Oklahoma, where 54 of the 77 counties, including the one in which I live, which is Cleveland County in the center, have food deserts, areas in which a significant percentage of the population does not have ready access to grocery stores where they can purchase fresh fruits and vegetables. So for many pregnant women in this state, fresh fruit and vegetables are indeed inaccessible. And yet public law and policy in Oklahoma, as in many other states, continues to hold mothers responsible for poor birth outcomes. Oklahoma is a state with poor infant and maternal mortality rates. Its efforts to improve the health of fetuses and neonates focus on educating mothers about diet and exercise, smoking, and the benefits of breastfeeding. There have been few attempts to make structural changes to ensure that all mothers have access to healthy food, clean water, and a safe and unpolluted environment in which to gestate their babies and raise their children. The case of Brittany Pula, with which I began, exemplifies the difference between the real and imagined risks to fetuses. This is narrowing in on Comanche County, where Pula is from. About 17% of the population of Comanche County, where Pula lived, is below the poverty line. About 13% have no health insurance. About 60% of the population of Comanche County lives a significant distance from a grocery store, making fresh, healthy food difficult to access. So this map actually shows the food deserts in Comanche County, or kind of narrowed. It shows some other counties, but I think Comanche County is sort of centered like that area around there. In the center of the map is Comanche County. Let me do it over here. Sorry. Comanche County is in the center, so these areas here are the food deserts in Comanche County. The infant mortality rate in Comanche County at the time of Pula's arrest was 8.9 deaths per 1,000 births, higher than the state rate of 7.7 per 1,000, which was in turn higher than the national rate of 5.79 per 1,000. Those rates have subsequently gone a little bit down, but at the time of her arrest, that's what they were. Oklahoma has the fourth worst maternal mortality rate in the country, behind Alabama, Kentucky, and Arkansas. Access to health care in general and to reproductive health services in particular is very poor. The ability to eat a healthy diet, get the right amount and kind of physical activity, and to avoid situations and substances that are harmful to the fetus has always been dependent on socioeconomic status. And yet, when women fail to follow the accepted pregnancy regimen, they're blamed for their individual failure. In the United States, we've yet to see sweeping policy changes that would allow all pregnant people to follow a healthy diet and exercise regimen. Such policies would include not only those traditionally linked to the health of women and children, such as mandatory paid maternity leave and universal health care covering prenatal care and childbirth, but also policies that would make healthy foods readily accessible to all. And as long as we remain convinced that the major threats to fetuses come from the women who carry them, we never will. All the advice on what to eat and what to do while pregnant strongly suggests that poor pregnancy outcomes, including miscarriages like Pula's, stillbirths, and disabled infants, are the fault of the mother. Almost everything that can go wrong with a pregnancy goes wrong because the mother fails to eat the right foods, drink the right beverages, get the right exercise, and maintain a calm and happy state of mind. Or worse, things go wrong because the mother has consumed the wrong substances, indulged in dangerous activities, or become angry or depressed. The burden of a successful birth, a full-term, healthy, beautiful, intelligent baby, is almost entirely on the mother, or at least that is what we are led to believe. Perhaps the starkest evidence for the persistence of the old idea that the womb is a dangerous place is to be found in the hysteria surrounding pregnant women like Pula who use drugs, especially but not exclusively illegal drugs. There have been hundreds of cases now in which pregnant women have been arrested and imprisoned for drug use and had their babies taken away, And in a great many of these cases, the infants were born healthy, and there was no evidence that prenatal drug exposure caused any lasting harm. The moral indignation heaped on women who use illicit drugs while pregnant is out of all proportion to the actual risks to the fetus. The prosecution of women who use drugs while pregnant is certainly a product of the growing belief that the fetus is a person whose rights must be protected, but the willingness of doctors, nurses, police, prosecutors, social workers, juries, and journalists to believe that illicit drugs cause inevitable and irreparable damage to fetuses is also rooted in the much older idea that the womb is a dangerous place. In the early 20th century, the notion of maternal imagination came under increasing criticism from obstetricians and embryologists. But the notion that maternal emotions, especially anger, stress, and depression, could harm the fetus has remained constant. As maternal imagination faded from science, it was replaced by concerns about stress and worry during pregnancy and their impact on the fetus. By the early 20th century, advice to pregnant women simultaneously denied the influence of maternal imagination and reaffirmed the importance of maintaining a proper emotional state. The notion that the mother's emotional state during pregnancy could affect her baby lingered on long after maternal imagination died. While maternal imagination is no longer a medical category, the idea that mothers' emotional states pose a threat to their fetuses has continued to permeate our culture. And I did this search yesterday. A search in the PubMed database for stress and pregnancy pulled up over 35,000 articles on the impact of maternal stress on the developing fetus. By contrast, a search for environmental toxins in pregnancy pulled up around 1,000 articles, and even scanning through the first page of these, several of them actually have to do with a woman's diet during pregnancy. I'm not denying that emotions can have real physiological effects on the body and that in pregnant women these might impact the fetus. But emotions do not occur in a social or cultural vacuum. Serenity, patience, and cheerfulness have long been considered desirable qualities in women, especially mothers. By contrast, anger has long been considered an inappropriate and unattractive emotion for women, especially Black women. Further, just as the ability to eat a healthy diet and perform the right kind of physical activity is closely tied to socioeconomic status, so too is the ability to manage stress. The higher up in the social hierarchy a woman is embedded, the less likely she is to experience stress, anxiety, depression, and irritability. The lower down the social ladder she finds herself, the more likely she is to experience these negative emotions. Finally, there's overwhelming evidence that exposure to chemicals and heavy metals in utero poses far greater risks to the life and health of fetuses than maternal diet and behavior during pregnancy, which makes the discrepancy between the articles on pregnancy and stress and pregnancy and environmental toxins particularly disturbing to me. Flint, Michigan provides a recent and tragic example of the dangers of prenatal exposure to lead. Up until April 2014, the city of Flint received water pumped from Lake Huron by the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department. In April, as a cost-saving measure, the city's emergency manager switched the water source to the Flint River, which turned out to have high levels of lead and other contaminants. The lead in the Flint water had devastating consequences for fetal life and health. It had devastating consequences for children's health and other health problems as well. But here I'm going to zero in on the consequences for fetal life and health. At least 2 separate studies have shown that the number of babies born in Flint with low birth weight increased during the period in which the water supply was contaminated with lead. Even more strikingly, the number of babies born to women in Flint dropped appreciably compared to women in other parts of Michigan. One study found that about 200 to 275 more children would have been born had Flint not switched its water source. So that's between 200 and maybe 275 fetuses who died in utero. They explained that the most plausible explanation of this drop is fetal death and miscarriage, not changes in fertility. Other environmental toxins also cause irreparable damage to fetuses in utero. Over 20 separate studies have found a link between fetal exposure to organophosphate pesticides and long-term permanent neurological damage. Despite these findings, the Environmental Protection Agency has refused to issue bans or even warnings about the use of these chemicals. And close to home, hydraulic fracturing, commonly known as fracking, is a process used to extract gas and oil from shale rock. Fracking provides cheap electricity and avoids the air pollution and carbon emissions that accompany other forms of fuel extraction. However, fracking is far more dangerous than the oil and gas industry admit, especially to children born near fracking sites. In fracking, liquid is injected into rock at high pressure, and this forces out the oil and gas. The chemicals used in fracking operations are toxic, and they regularly contaminate water supplies, including the drinking water of nearby communities. Multiple studies have demonstrated the health hazards of living near fracking sites, including harm to fetuses. Rates of miscarriage are significantly higher near fracking sites, and newborns in these areas are more likely to be underweight and to suffer from other health problems. That is a map of the active fracking sites in Oklahoma, and that, again, centered on Lawton, is Comanche County. Comanche County, where Poolah lived, has at least 30 active fracking sites. And yet, instead of focusing on environmental hazards like these that pose such risks to fetuses, or ensuring that all pregnant women have access to healthy food, clean water, safe neighborhoods, and high-quality medical care, our elected representatives, obstetricians, prosecutors, and police consistently seek to protect them from their mothers, to protect fetuses from their mothers. Miscarriages are treated as suspicious deaths rather than personal tragedies. Substance abuse and addiction are treated like child abuse rather than medical problems. Pregnant women are subjected to intrusive investigations and invasive medical procedures. None of this has had a positive impact on the health and well-being of fetuses. If anything, it has harmed fetuses. These actions perpetuate a culture that has treated pregnant mothers suspiciously for thousands of years. There are real and present dangers to fetuses, but these dangers do not come from their mothers. Thank you. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the curricula that prevails in a lot of these medical schools, where a lot of these medical studies are emanating from, right? What is the solution there? How can we think about how we train doctors, and that could that help us get to a better place in the way they look at problems, and therefore they can see.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think, broadly speaking, the curriculum of medical schools does not devote any or near enough attention to the social determinants of health. So I think, medical students are kind of trained to only assess kind of biological causes of, they're not trained to kind of think about kind of larger structural issues like poverty, like food deserts, like environmental toxins, what is the solution for that? Obviously, I think medical schools should be doing kind of a better job of teaching this. However, I think a thing that is happening that's positive is I think that there is a lot more interest in putting this into the curriculum for pre-medical students at the undergraduate level. So I mean, I think there are kind of OU and probably OSU as well. Like, there's lots more interest in having kind of undergraduate majors that are kind of on medical humanities or kind of social science and humanities perspectives on medicine. And I think that provides an opportunity to actually introduce these topics like before these students get to medical school, where the curriculum is so stuffed full of classes that are exclusively kind of scientific, that there's kind of felt like there's sort of no room for these broader perspectives. So, yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, me?
Go ahead, yeah.
Hi. So, thank you for this. I'm curious if you've examined how sort of both the separate gynecological, I guess, exploration and likewise persecution has occurred, particularly with the more, the labor class of women. And I was thinking of how most of the women that we see criminalized for miscarriage and such are women of a lower socioeconomic status.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also thinking of, as you briefly mentioned, enslaved women. I'm thinking of how enslaved Black women were the defining enslaved labor class, and how doctors were brought in, and that's how we came to Fistula, played by J. Marion Sims, lecturing women and such. But it was due to his innovations that he then later would serve elite, wealthy white women in the Northeast. And so I'm kind of curious about the comparison of when, particularly women of lower socioeconomic status or lower social status period, when their wombs were of value, and then when their wombs were devalued.
Yeah. You know, I don't know that that's ever stopped. You know what I mean? Like even in the ancient world, right? There are like women who are kind of, you know, the wives and daughters of like citizens. These women's reproductive capacities are kind of highly valued, right? And highly like protected. Whereas, enslaved women or kind of poor women, their reproductive capacities are completely devalued. All these sort of ancient writings on like all these things that you have to do to like all the things Serena says you have to do to like when you're pregnant, that's so your baby is born with like a noble soul, like a beautiful and noble, right? And so there's very much this sense that kind of only the upper classes are beautiful and noble, right? Some authors will kind of acknowledge that like that poorer women can't follow this sort of like they have to work. For one, they have to perform kind of hard labor while they're pregnant, and they can't eat all this refined food. And this is often just sort of brushed aside as well. The poor are just, their bodies are just sort of coarser and less refined than those of kind of the wealthy. So I feel like there's always that sort of valuing some women's fertility and reproductive capacities and devaluing others is kind of is itself a kind of a long thread, where when we come to the 20th century, you're absolutely right. It's women like Pula who are like women of color, particularly Black women, have kind of the highest, I'm sure you know this, highest levels of like maternal mortality, highest rates of infant mortality, and they're the ones most likely to be kind of surveilled. And reported to police if there's any kind of concern about their behavior during pregnancy. They're the most likely to kind of face this sort of prosecutions for drug use or other things during pregnancy, and the least likely to kind of be treated with kind of like care and compassion and high quality of medical care. So you know, so I feel like these distinctions kind of like still exist today. They morph and they change, kind of like whose fertility kind of matters and whose does not. But I think it's all part of a kind of a long, that too has kind of a very long history. Yeah. Yeah, did you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's another tough one. We're asking really good questions tonight. I was curious about comparing accountability. Most specifically, during your lecture, you talked about unintentional natural births, and specifically during the Middle Ages and Greco-Roman times when those children had defects, right? And they could be natural defects, but they were blamed on the mother. My question is, how does that punishment, if there was one, compare to today and intentional preventative deformity that are happening to children, and are oil companies being held accountable? And I want to talk about the difference of that, if you wouldn't mind enlightening us.
Yeah, so to begin at the end, no, to my knowledge, oil companies are not being held accountable. Yeah, every time I hear our governor say he wants to be the most pro-life governor in the country, look at the oil industry. So that, broadly, I would say it's much easier, and the reason that I put Comanche County up is that, like, why didn't anyone take that into account in Poolaw's case? I mean, if she lived in Comanche County, it's like, I don't know anything about her personally, but it's likely she lived near one of these fracking sites, or she lived in a food desert. Like, why is she being forced to take kind of accountability for this just misfortune? I mean, miscarriages happen, like, and most of the time we don't even know why, right? So why is she being, like, why is it individual women like that who have to kind of take the accountability for, you know, the kind of policies that mean that, you know, women in this county don't have access to fresh food, that they have to, like, you know, live near fracking sites, like, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's, I'm thinking of a line from Monica Casper, who wrote this wonderful book, Baby Lost, and she says, it's just so much easier to blame women than to change social structures. Like, women are kind of malleable, but social structures are, you know, kind of much harder to change. Does that kind of answer your question?
That does. And it kind of explains how prevention is kind of elusive, because it's almost like a punishment to pregnant people.
Yeah.
Is lack of care.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My question is, especially in talking about value, do you see or have you seen any difference in economic systems like classism, or not classism, but like capitalism versus XYZ, and how that plays a role? Because as we talk about how lower social status typically means that your ability to birth is devalued, I kind of disagree in a sense, because it's like we are creating systems of legal slavery, and how do we, you know, work those systems if we don't have a bunch of bodies to do that? And so that kind of like switch that back and forth of valuing bodies that can produce more bodies,
Right.
and devaluing them at the same time, and how is
Yeah.
that playing a role in economic systems?
Yeah. No, I think, yeah, that adds a much needed sort of layer of nuance to what I said earlier, because of course, like in the American South before the Civil War, I mean, enslaved women's reproductive capacities are valued in as much as they're producing more property for their owners. So certainly, but I still think there's this sort of distinction between, you know, babies of kind of enslaved women or working class women, who are seen more as kind of like cogs in a wheel, if you will, in the machinery, rather than kind of babies of middle and upper class kind of like white women who are expected to be more like intelligent, more kind of like carefully nurtured, and you see what I'm saying, kind of. So I do think there is kind of like a distinction there, but and that a lot of this sort of advice, despite this advice being, the idea that you should eat vegetables and fruits while you're pregnant, et cetera, like, I'm not saying this is wrong, right? I think it is demonstrably like a good thing to do, but like, why do we make such a big deal out of like promoting these healthy diets and then not do everything possible to make those diets available to everyone, right? So I feel like there's, yeah, so, whoops. Oh, sorry, I accidentally touched that. But so we have kind of all of this sort of set of advice, but insidiously, really, and like, this is why I like this quote from that older edition of What to Expect When You're Expecting that says, well, anyone could eat healthy. Well, no, that's not true. That's demonstrably kind of like not true, but we keep kind of insisting like it's true that everyone can eat this way, and yet we're not actually, it's not true, and we're not going to take we're not going to value the babies of poorer women enough to make it so that they can have healthy diets too, that they can have prenatal care, that they can have clean water, that they can have safe housing, et cetera. So, yeah. Yes.
Question about language, because you began talking about the way that the word infant had been manipulated for a certain effect by the press and by the prosecution. And I noticed in your own talk, you mostly used fetus, you sometimes used infant, and then in your answers to Q&A, you were using babies.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you can talk about your own conscious choices about when you in your own work
Yeah.
want to use those different terms, because they do have very different emotional connotations.
Yeah, they do. I mean, there are times when I'm trying to be kind of more clinical and more specific, but I also do acknowledge that, most pregnant people don't speak of their fetuses. They speak of their babies. So I'm also, in a way, kind of trying to respect that for a lot of pregnant people, they're thinking of the fetus that they're gestating as a child, as a baby, and that there's nothing wrong with that. Like I think we ought. I think kind of we ought to be able to kind of allow people to do that without the fear that it's sort of playing into a kind of pro-life movement's assertion that a fetus is a human being, right? I feel a bit kind of uneasy with it. I mean, I struggled with it to some degree in writing the book, and I guess I maybe particularly when I'm talking on the fly, I get a little sloppy about it. But I'm kind of both trying to acknowledge that clearly what in that first case is being done is they're completely conflating a newborn and a fetus. I mean, that's not even a viable fetus. On the other hand, I don't know how Brittany Poulain herself would have described that. She might have described, I don't know, and I don't presume at all to speak for her at all, but she might have seen this as kind of the loss of a baby. Yeah, I think, I feel like I'm getting kind of tangled up. I think it's a great question. I continue to feel that I do not want to ever come across as being critical of pregnant people who, because I did this, of course, myself when I was pregnant. I didn't talk about my fetus. Like, I didn't talk about my sons as fetuses ever. Like, and not that there would be anything wrong with doing that, but that just feels too clinical, right? I don't think there's kind of anything particularly wrong with pregnant people referring to the thing they're gestating as a baby. That does not have to be taken to mean that, you know, they believe that this is a person and that, like, you know, nobody has a right to an abortion, for example. I don't know. I think that's a kind of unsatisfactory answer. I'm unsatisfied with it. But I think it's a measure of kind of how sort of how kind of polarized the sort of debate about reproductive rights in this country has gotten. Yeah.
Probably a really good point
Okay.
to end.
All right.
Because we are at the end of our time, but I want to invite everyone who wants to hang around. We have some refreshments, and you can certainly come up and ask a question if you didn't have an opportunity. And I'm just really so happy with this turnout, so I just want to thank everyone again for being here. And yeah, come back for our next event, whenever that might be. Thank you so much.